Yep, I just jumped the gun on the video. Let's get started, and we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence originally. And if you recall the last lecture about intelligence, I said, well, that would be it. We just do one part. So this actually isn't a second part of that lecture, but it's a related topic, obviously. So we talked about intelligence in general, and when we talked about that, we discussed emotional intelligence in there as a small component of that unit. It's worth expanding on this a little bit, I think. So I've added this into the mix, emotional intelligence. So we want to consider for a few moments here this construct of emotional intelligence by examining its underlying theoretical models, measurement tools. Is it valid? Its validity and applications in real world settings. So emotional intelligence, or being emotionally smart or smart about emotions, something to that nature or to that effect. So our learning objectives today, and there are a bunch of them, but obviously to understand the theoretical foundations of emotional intelligence, you can just read this with me. The relationship between emotion and cognition, just roughly we'd say like feeling and thinking, distinguish between mixed and ability models of emotional intelligence. A whole bunch of models, and we'll look at, for example, trait is another one, a trait model, a bunch of these different models, and we'll just distinguish between them, maybe evaluate them a little bit. 3, understand various methods of measuring emotional intelligence. 4, describe the evolution of emotional intelligence as a what? A theoretical, success-oriented, and achievement-based framework. Framework for what? For determining intelligence within the confines of one's emotions or evaluating someone else's emotions. Identify and define key concepts of emotional intelligence, including emotions regulation, expression of emotion, understanding emotion, etc., and the ways they contribute to decision-making, relationship building, and overall well-being. So here's just a little exercise we want to work on, just to get a sense of maybe what you know or how to evaluate what you know in terms of this subject. So we want to take a few minutes, maybe a couple minutes, and really this is something you're going to kind of pause and do on your own. We're not going to draw out the lecture, but we want to look at a something that's what is called think, pair, share activity, or it's sometimes called TPS. It gives you a chance to think about something, to write it down, and that is your responses to some questions, and then pair up with somebody next to you, which obviously we can't do right now. But in theory, if you want to use this at some point with your youth group or small group Bible study or family or something like that, think, pair, share. So throw out a couple questions, and then let people pair up and determine their responses, and then kind of share the material. But for now, you're just going to do this yourself pretty much. So, get a piece of paper, get a pen. Really want you to do these activities, not just sort of fast forward the video, which you can do, but don't. To grab a piece of paper and a pen and just take a shot. It's not a quiz. You're not going to be graded on it, but it's just for your own benefit. No one will ever know, but a couple of questions would be, let's put them up here, I think. What is emotional intelligence? And the other, why is it important to understand? And from here on out on the slide, you'll see EI, but that's just a way of a symbol for emotional intelligence. So what is emotional intelligence? Why is it important to understand emotional intelligence? Of course, this is your view. What do you think it is? Just pause the video and then come back after you're finished doing that. Okay, so look at whatever responses you have then. And by the time we finish today, you'll be able to sort of go back and say, well, is that really what I thought emotional intelligence to be, considering what I know it actually is now. and perhaps why it's important. So let's go on to the next. We looked at, first we want to look at, I should say, what is emotional intelligence, and then you see these other models. There's a 4-branch ability model, there's mixed and trait models, and you see what those are, and how much room do you have for debate in this? Is this like precise and exact science, or is there some latitude here, and then some practical application to this? So first thing we want to do is look at what is EI, what is emotional intelligence, and you see it there in front of you. Emotional intelligence is the intersection of emotions and cognitions and the ability to leverage emotions to enhance thinking, judgment, and behavior. So when we say intersection, we really mean when the emotions and cognition kind of work together in some relationship in some way. How does that dynamic work? Cognition would be the presence of knowledge, really, but more so the acquisition of knowledge. How do you acquire knowledge and understanding that goes along with that through thought, through experience, through the senses, something of that nature. And emotions, this idea of the affective side of our nature. We feel things in some way, and not just feel things in a physical, tactile sense. Like touching on my arm, pinching my arm, I could feel that. But I mean, feeling something as being rooted in our affections, and this is with an A, not an E, but our affections. What things affect us. What things make us feel a certain way, and how do we process through all of that? Well, a simpler definition than this somewhat technical definition would be emotional intelligence is when emotions and how you think work together to use the emotions to enhance thinking, judgment, and behavior. So rather than the word ability to leverage, we're just saying to use. How does what's the dynamic sense of all of this? How does it all function? How does it all work? So next, we're looking at the history of emotional intelligence, and we have 2 domains here: the intelligence and emotions, which we looked at in the previous slide. Traditionally, cognition and the emotions have been viewed as separate domains, with emotion an impediment to cognition. So is that true? Meaning it's an impedance or something that gets in the way. Do the emotions get in the way to our ability to acquire and possess knowledge? How do the emotions sort of obstruct that? And so when you look at the relationship between intelligence and emotion, some might say, well, emotion just gets in the way. You can't. It sort of limits one's ability to exercise one's intellect or to think reasonably, simply because the emotions cloud judgment or something like that. So perhaps you might be in that camp, and you might think that's true. You might be swinging the pendulum the other way, and saying, I don't know, sometimes I could see things more clearly. I could perceive the needs of others if I myself am feeling the full breadth of need, in feeling the full breadth of suffering. I'm like for example, what if the emotions made you more intelligent with regard to the needs of those who suffer from mental illness or something like that? I don't mean to imply it takes mental illness to understand mental illness, but at the same time, you could just argue all of these things, right? Well, what about Aristotle? If you bring him into this, talking about the relationship between intelligence and emotions. So there are traces that emotional arousal is positive, dating to Aristotle. We can see where some have taken this in that direction. But cultural norms generally teach us to be tough and to repress emotional type of thinking. So if you think along those lines, you'd say, don't make a decision, in a moment of great stress, or sometimes you have to. But if it's a major life kind of decision, you don't want to do that when, the wheels are all falling off, when everything's in chaos. That's not the time to really make a major sort of life decision. But that might be an extreme case. You had people like the Stoics. If we go back to the time of Aristotle, and contemporaneous with Aristotle would be Stoicism, or the thinking of the Stoics, which even if you don't really understand fully Stoicism, that you hear the word Stoic generally in the context, or somebody says, "Yeah, well, you're just a Stoic sort of person," which means you're not a person to show your emotions, something like that. But the Stoics would say that their supreme value was to have equanimity. Equanimity. So that's a big word, right? But it means like, so if everything is going great and wonderful and you're blessed, you're not high-fiving and jumping up and down and cheering. And when everything is going horribly wrong by your judgment, you're also not, in the dumps and depressed and despairing. So equanimity would be that you sort of maintain this steady sort of placid, serene, and so the Stoic person would be the person who really doesn't show a lot of emotion, or very little at all. If you're familiar with the old Star Trek series, or even the new movies that came out, the Spock character, unable to show emotion. But with the Stoics, they felt that just wasn't consistent with eudaimonia, which is another word, with what Aristotle would call well-being. One's well-being. So one's well-being would be to keep one's emotions in control, because somehow emotions could disrupt some of the more, let's say, higher affections, some of the more noble pursuits of life, the intellectual pursuits, the ability to reason, the ability to perceive the world around you accurately. Okay, enough about that. How about limitations to IQ has led to new theory. So in the 1970s, of which I am a veteran. I was 10 years old in 1970. So that's kind of the era I grew up. But in that era, scientists began to recognize limitations of the intelligence quotient. Remember the IQ? And I can remember we all had to sit for IQ tests, when we were kids in school. Specifically, let's say the limitations of the intelligence quotient, or the IQ. Specifically with its inability to explain individual differences unrelated to just cognitive ability. So let's take that apart for a second. So limitations to IQ, and they would say, well, listen, if you don't take into account one's emotional intelligence, whether emotions play a positive or negative or however that is, but if you don't take that into account, and maybe other non-cognitive areas into account, you really don't get a full picture of one's intelligence. You're sort of saying that intelligence is just left to being book smart, something like that. It's just the academic stuff. That's all we're going to measure, is the academic stuff, when it's really better to have a broader understanding, like that sort of G theory as a concept, but a very broader understanding to incorporate more aspects, for example, of one's personality in there, more personality type of orientation to this. Next is Gardner and Sternberg. They presented more inclusive theories of intelligence, leading the way to researchers to begin exploring the influences of emotion on thinking, judgment, and memory. So the Stoics, just to go back to them, they had 4 virtues, and I mentioned the more nobler things, right? So they would feel that emotions could get in the way, and I got ahead of myself a little bit, but they were justice, courage, wisdom, and temperance, which would be self-control. And so the emotions would just, work against that. So do we take that Stoic mentality? So Sternberg and Gardner are sort of saying, no, let's not take the Stoic route, but let's say that emotions do play a part. I have to say that in a lot of Christian circles as well, that some take the idea of emotions. Well, anyway, let me just, before I get myself in trouble, let me just say that think about the role of emotions in your life, as a child of God. What is the proper role for them? So Jonathan Edwards, who was probably one of the greatest American theologians ever, wrote a book, and you can find it, Religious Affections. And you say, well, what was his purpose for writing that book? Well, if you go back to his time, which is 1730s, 1740s, and on his heyday, Edwards saw a great revival poured out in New England. And with that came just exuberance and fantastic expressions of emotion. So rather than saying, and he felt that type of display would just burn the revival out. In other words, there was a genuine fire of revival, but that fire could just consume the whole revival. It could just go completely off the rails and destroy it, because sometimes with sort of fantastic emotional displays also comes some behavior that's inappropriate, and all kinds of other things that people say that they might use their emotions to validate, the truth of those things. And of course, Edwards is a Bible guy, but he also did not discount the emotions. He did say they have a role, but that role is within range. And I think we have to understand that as well as Christians. God created these emotions, right? So he created us to be people who mirror his intellect, emotion, and will. Maybe not mirror, but at least display, the image and likeness of God. And so in some way, some analogical fashion, perhaps, that we are like in this ever, finite, fallible way. We are like this, but we see God displaying emotion. We likewise are people that display emotion. So sometimes it's wise to control in some sense, obviously, to just let one's emotions run wild. For example, you might sense fear, even rational fear, but then if you created a continuum, draw a straight line and put a pole here and a pole here, which is, say, a dot here and a dot there. So within then is a range, and a median range being in the middle. So you have this continuum, and a continuum is composed of two extremes. And so on the one hand, you might have a healthy sort of rational fear. Over here, you have panic. So then what would you have on this side? Would just be like, in the face of imminent danger, you are basically neglectful, maybe like that. So it's one thing to have an emotion, but it's another thing to let it give way to just panic, or someone who is discouraged could give way to despair, something like that. So there's a lot of ways to look at this, and I think it's worth considering, and you'll continue to consider these throughout your life. There's a Goldman theory of emotional intelligence, and Goldman's book is a fairly a classic on this subject, one that many people will cite again and again: Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. So he's telling us what his position is on that as well. Goldman then is going to blend emotional related skills, cognitive intelligence, and personality. He's going to bring these all together in a way to understand IQ in a broader sense, or intelligence in a broader sense than a mere academic quotient, something like that. Now, there was a video that you were to see, and I could pull it up, but if I put it internal into this video, then YouTube will block it for copyrights and stuff like that. But I won't do that. But it was a TED talk, and this was Daniel Goleman, actually, who was doing this talk. It's from 2007. If you want to find that, it's just why aren't we more compassionate? Is the name of it. And if you Google that, I'm sure, or put it into your search on YouTube, you'll find it and you can watch it. So I took a look at that. And basically what Goldman is talking about is this idea of emotional intelligence and taking this notion of compassion, which is an emotional response to something. And, he speaks about a case where there was a group of Princeton Theological Seminary students, and they were all given this task of preparing a sermon, a short talk, and they were given this topic, and half of them, well, they were going to be given a topic, and so the class was divided in half. Half of the class was to do the parable of the Good Samaritan. The other half of the class was to just do random topics in general. And then one by one, they were to go to another building, and sort of begin to prepare this study. So as they went out to this other building, they passed by a man who was bent over and obviously in need. And did they stop to help him? And the case was that they really didn't stop to help him at all. And so you have to say, well, why? They're Princeton Theological Seminary students. Were they just contemplating the parable and so in earnest about contemplating the parable that they were given that they didn't have time to stop? They were just in a hurry, maybe to get their assignment done. Were they otherwise preoccupied? So what comes into the discussion about compassion for Goleman is something that he even revealed of his own life. That this sort of, again, the continuum and the two polarities, the two extremes. And on the one hand was altruism, and on the other hand was narcissism. So altruism would be a purely good deed. And I challenge you to point to anything other than the cross as a pure form of altruism. That is to say, you had no other motive, for doing this. And if you really dig deep down, to, some occasion where you truly did something and you thought was selfless, at some point when you reflect back and take pride in that, then you really realize that you did that for some less than altruistic reason. But narcissism, on the other hand, would then be you're just completely self-absorbed. And the altruistic act would be to empathize or to have compassion. And so what Goleman was bringing out is he was saying that you have these two polarities. He doesn't use this language, but I will. But these two polarities, and then draw a line between them, the two extremes of altruism and narcissism. And there is compassion somewhere in there. And what he's saying is there's a whole spectrum. Instead of using the word continuum, he's using the word spectrum, because within that spectrum, between the two polarities, the two extremes, there's all shades of gray. There's all different ranges, perhaps, of compassion. So if you said compassion over the top and complete narcissism, so that would be a sort of a you get a 0 on the range of compassion. But on the other side, then you have altruism, where you get 100% maybe. So there's somewhere in there that would be sort of a proper range in the spectrum of compassion. Um, are we likely to find a completely altruistic person? Are we likely to find the completely narcissistic person? But you can find, if you then go to the mean, that everything here, as you head towards narcissism, is tainted by narcissism, and everything this way, as you head towards altruism, is tainted by altruism, right? There's some range of that, 90%, 80%, 70%, 60%, something like that. So somewhere in the middle, you'd find, just either the truest expression of this or some elements of narcissism and altruism in that. I'll be compassionate, but it's I that am being compassionate. So I'm still talking about I. I was compassionate. I helped this person. And the more the I comes out, the more we're tipping which way. And the more it's the other person, and not taking credit, and just the deed, the active compression, yeah, compassion itself. It becomes all for that. We tend towards altruism. Well, one of the things he brings out is this field of social neuroscience, and in the neuroscience, if you recall, all the way back to the initial lectures, we were talking about how we're wired, and all those neurons firing and the receptors and things of that nature. And he's saying that we are wired. We are people who are wired to help. In other words, we feel as though we should help automatically. That would be a normal human function, is to default to compassion or to help. We have this sense of wanting to identify, wanting to empathize. And empathy really occurs when our experience, sort of reaches out to somebody else's experience. There's a concurrence of experience. So if we see somebody that's unhappy and sad, our ability for sadness and unhappiness and those types of emotions, and having experienced them so many times, it just begins to connect and bind with that. And that's empathy. That's so much more than sympathy. Sympathy is basically a detachment. It's basically an observation that says, well, I understand. We used to send out sympathy cards, right? If someone has experienced a death, and you send your condolences or a sympathy card out. But empathy would being right there with them by the graveside, holding on to them, supporting them, weeping with them, your arm around their shoulder. And that's so much different than just mere sympathy. You might go to a memorial service with a friend for someone that you don't know, just to, what we say, pay your condolences or offer your sympathy. But your ability to empathize is minimal. And so what he's talking about is that we're wired to empathize with people, and that empathy is somehow plotted on this spectrum, between altruism and narcissism. So I think it's interesting, to consider these things, and certainly consistent with what we're trying to study here. So let's go on, the ability models, and look at some. So what is emotional intelligence? We've considered that. And now some of these ability models and what we call the four branch model. So two of these on this particular slide, and then the other two on the next slide. And so this model, that is the four branch model, proposes that four fundamental emotion related abilities comprise the emotional intelligence. So those four things are perception. Now this isn't two here, but the first one, perception or expression of emotion. So you can perceive it or you can express it. That's number one. A second would be the use of emotion to facilitate thinking. The third, understanding of emotion. And the fourth, management of emotion in oneself and others. So we just want to look at the first two, perception of emotion. And that involves identity of emotions of self, identity of motions of others, or the ability for people to identify not only their own emotions, but the emotions of others. And how do you do this? Through emotional displays. So, I mean, what kind of different emotions have you felt in different situations? And this relates to this idea of the use of emotion to facilitate thinking. All right. So how much you think about emotions in your own life? Certain times when you've displayed maybe very powerfully certain emotions. I can think of maybe in the sense of moods, like use of emotion to facilitate thinking. In what types of moods could your ability to think be impeded? Or are there certain types of moods where your ability to think could be enhanced? So as you can imagine, you would think that there are negative moods and there are positive moods. So let's talk about maybe a negative mood for a second. How about somebody who's pretty critical? Now, if we went into personality theory and said, well, there's a lot of, maybe there's certain basic personalities, and then some people have dominant and recessive forms of those personalities. So one might be very analytical, and sometimes analytical people can be cold and indifferent. They can be impersonal and very critical. So there are certain personalities that are prone to certain negative moods, and there is no personality that escapes both positive and negative. So someone might be more susceptible to other types of negative moods given the type of personality, right? But being critical. Now, you could take that two ways. You could look at that as a negative mood, and maybe it's negative, not in the sense that it's particularly bad, but it's negative in the sense that it's looking for something that's missing. A critic. A critic who says that's bad means there's an absence of good, right? So, but also being critical. Could being critical, we say critical thinking, could being critical enhance your ability to think, by maybe paying attention to details or finding faults. Now, it's wonderful to find faults. If I can remember as a teenager working in a furniture mill, working up on the third floor, and it was the assembly floor. And so things were being assembled and going all around that assembly line, all the way from, well, here are the parts, assemble the parts, put them in the press, glue them, attach the screws, and everything goes on to the next person, puts the hardware on, so it goes around and around. Then there's staining. And then when this whole thing is done, before anything went to the showroom or was packaged to be sent, it had to be inspected. And so you could find little cracks and flaws where somebody finished it, and during the sanding process, it just covered over a split. I shouldn't say crack, but a split. And, the average person in the store is not going to see that. But I was put on a particular position, not only to observe where it was split, but also to repair it. So I'd have to sand it back down, and there was a knife that you would heat up, and then this sort of plasticized type of material that you could melt on the knife and then drip it into that crack. And then, so I'm just telling you, if you go out and buy real wood, people like me could tell you where it was repaired, so you could repair it. You wouldn't just throw it out. It would be repaired in this way. So that's sometimes the ability to, a negative emotion, could be in the wrong context, be used in the wrong way, but somehow these things like criticism can be redeemed. Now, if you're just overly critical of people and that's all you do is just walk around and find flaws in people, and some people do this, right? Generally, you don't hang around those people, but they generally are like that. They're going to find every single flaw that you have and feel God put them on the earth to tell you exactly what all your flaws are. And then they move on to the next person. And they don't seem to ever look in the mirror So of course, and they're not very open to receiving that. That's not a good Christian quality, is it? Um, but a positive mood, on the other hand, to be able to see the bigger picture. In other words, instead of being so critical down in the details, okay, and thank the Lord he didn't make everybody that way. But let's say somebody else approaches it a different way. So I'm not so concerned about that little split there. I'm not so concerned about that. I want to see the big picture, you know. I'll take a step back and I'll see all those people working so hard and putting all those things together and building all those things. Then I'll step back even farther from that, and I'll see that company and how it employs all those people and all those families are taken care of. Then I'll step back even farther from that and see how all of those pieces of furniture got placed into people's homes, and kids and grandkids enjoying that, and so on. So there's the ability to see the bigger picture, or possibilities and things like that. And you might say, yeah, I'd like that kind of person. I like that kind of person that comes around and doesn't criticize absolutely everything that I do, and is more positive, more reassuring, sees the bigger picture, and it seems to be more supportive. But you can't run from criticism, so you need a little of both. We all do. We all need a little of both. I don't like hearing someone be critical of maybe some decision that I made, or some goal that I have, something that I want to do. And a lot of times I don't want to hear the criticism, but I've learned that I really have to be open to that. Not all criticism is good criticism. However, you can consider a lot of these things, and you also have to consider the source, right? So have you ever been, just to think of the relationship between mood, emotion, and the ability to think clearly and not to be clouded by emotion, the positive and negative. Let's try to get a little perspective on this, and so I encourage you to think along with. I'll give you a personal example. I want you to think along with me on this about a stressful situation in your life. I mean, super stressful, something that you just thought you're going to snap, you're going to break. How did you respond in that? Did you find that your emotions were useful in that context, or did they get in the way? In other words, you're in a stressful situation. You have to make some type of decision. You have to keep going. You have to move forward. Something just suddenly came upon you, and you have to function and you have to act. Did you just cave into your emotions? Are you've just decided, the best way to handle this is for me to check out. I'm just going to lay flat on my back and do nothing. The storm will pass eventually. But did you find that you can't always do that, and that's never the right thing to do? So let me give you a stressful situation, and I've been in, quite a few of them. I'm thinking about, or the one I thought of was going back like about 20 years ago. Our daughter, she's 39 in June, and she's our oldest. It's about 20 years ago, might not have been quite 20 years ago, she'd finished community college here locally. And so I think it was the first year that she was commuting to SUNY Albany, which we're probably 45, 50 miles away. So she would head out, and she had to cross a main road, but it was like October of the year. Her windows were frosted up on her car, and she'd done what she can to scrape it. And yet there's this one intersection, a very dangerous intersection, and the sun was coming in just the direction. So it was just, and you can get this, right? When the sun just gets right in your eyes and you can't see. And she began to cross over that highway, thinking for sure that the roadway was clear. So she was hit on the, she's crossing this way, and somebody just hit her right in the front. The car not only spun this way, but flipped over and was on the road on the other side of the road. This was 7 o'clock in the morning. The reason why I know that is because the local kind of fire siren in town went off because they were calling the ambulance crews and the fire trucks. And in about 2 minutes after, we got a call at the house, and we were told, and my son and I, Junior, which had been the next oldest at the time, he and I we just fled out of the house, and it was about a mile away up to the scene of the accident. So there was Amy. Basically, they had to get the saws to cut her out of the car. She's hanging upside down, slumped over the wheel, really looking lifeless. So I just went into full what are we going to do mode? Not panic. What are we going to do? But who's doing what and where? How are we doing that? Who's in charge of that? Who's doing that? I just go into this whole mode instead of the hysterics. Now, there are some that just could go into complete hysteria. But my son and I, and this is one thing I guess my guys have learned through the years, and even our daughter at this point have learned through the years that that's not the option. It's just to fall apart and go into complete hysteria. So deal with what's in front of you. So we were not at all incapacitated. Was the emotion there? Well, sure. I didn't. I could have thought our daughter was dead. In fact, did think our daughter was dead. There's no movement. She slumped over the wheel, hanging in this car. They had to cut her out, cut the safety belt and all these things. So I really had no idea. But you really have to think, and we've been in a lot of other situations for other families. I mean, as a pastor through the years, I've buried infants. I've been there. I've seen infants die. I've seen teenagers die. I've seen I've been called into emergency rooms where there's a dying teenager who was in a car wreck with the mother sobbing next to the bed, and just numerous of these when it's somebody else. So then it's like empathy that we talked about. But in this case, that was our daughter. So I found that whole thing, I had to sort of distance myself from that and consider, is she being taken care of? What's her situation? How's this? And so on and so on and so on. And we had, there's a lot of things that came out of that, by the way. We had just incredible care by those first responders that showed up. And we never found out until later that, of course, we're all arriving on the scene after the first responders are there. But how did she survive until that point? So she had cut a major artery and should have just bled to death at the scene. But we found out later that someone who we don't know, and maybe we'll never know, had found her and took a coat and gave it to her to compress that, and then gone. I think this was some kind of angel, right? Some kind of coat wearing angel. I don't know. Just interesting. The person didn't stay there at the scene, but just that ended up saving her life. Anyway, that's just an idea, emotion, and how emotion relates to your ability to think clearly. So you could just say, oh, this is terrible, it's desperate, go into full hysteria and maybe impede your ability to think rationally, or it could sharpen your ability. Now, remember before on intelligence, we said you could improve your intelligence, but it takes work. Just like to go a little stoic here, you can control your emotions. And if you're prone to panic, if you're prone to panic attacks and fear and all this stuff, you can discipline yourself, that you don't have to, sort of reel it out that far. You can begin to have these emotions, but in a closer range of self-control, which is a spiritual which is one of the fruit of the Spirit, right? Or one of those fruits, or literally fruits. It's singular in Greek. So this is this combined thing, and one of those things is temperance or self-control, and it can be learned. So do we experience emotion? Are emotions bad? No, we experience them, but we also have the duty to do what's right in a given situation, and the power to do what's right in a given situation if we maintain control of those instead of letting them control us. Understanding of emotion, and where do emotions come from? So we want to have the ability to be able to separate out emotional states, see variations based on the cause of the emotion. How do various emotions work together? Well, this ability is seeing how multiple emotions can work together, maybe to successfully discriminate between negative emotions that could lead to more effective emotion management. We should be able to label these emotions, and they sneak up on us. Like if you tend to be a very analytical, I can be a very, very analytical, critical, task-oriented person, as much as I have a pastor's heart and am a people person and an evangelist. If I'm not careful, I could just slip into a very studious, analytical, and detached type of lifestyle, which is counterproductive to the pastoral evangelist values and gifts that I have. But I have to discriminate, in other words, not in a negative sense, but discriminate means to isolate those, know what those are, know when I am getting out of balance, and things of that nature. So management of emotion, maybe to consider that, the ability to recognize the value of all emotions, in appropriate context, and the appropriate outlet of emotion, allowing yourself to feel angry, but not reacting violently and hurting someone. So what is that all about? You might become angry in a sense of moral outrage because you see ungodliness around you. But I might even say to be careful about that. I mean, that's justified. It's warranted that you become angry at displays of sin. But you want to be careful with that, because that can lead to a self-righteous kind of pious mentality. So you want to temper that or balance that with a more introspective look and say, well, am I ever outraged about my own behavior? Am I ever outraged about my lack of righteous acts, habits that have formed in my life, things that are inconsistent with the life of Christ in me? Does this give me an internal sense of moral outrage? And so again, you always have this continuum and the polarities. Okay, this might be righteous indignation, righteous outrage. Over here, then, could be hostility, aggressiveness, violent behavior, which you say, no. And so up here, you're saying, like, well, here's a fear, here's a range. What is the appropriate range? And probably you've never really done an honest evaluation of your own emotions, and if you just made a scale of that, and you sort of measured your own emotional intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, we might say, well, let's chart our spiritual gifts or something like that. But I don't know that anybody charts their emotions, and their emotions can govern a lot of your life. And you either just repress your emotions, but I don't recommend doing that, or you acknowledge them and say that God has given me the ability to feel and have these affective types of experiences, but there's a certain range into which those can be appropriately exercised and experienced. And then beyond that, well, maybe I'm opening myself up to temptation. I'm if I go to the extreme sense of moral outrage, then I'm going to leave myself open to the temptation that I myself am capable of judging the righteousness of others and so on. And you know where all that can lead. So there's appropriate and inappropriate emotional displays. And are there ever times when an inappropriate display may be socially acceptable? Now, I'm not saying that you would consider it to be acceptable, but that others in society might consider it to be acceptable. So there's appropriate emotional displays. So if somebody's cheering at a ball game or something like that, or you're crying at a funeral, well, those are sort of empathy in two different directions. But there's inappropriate emotional displays as well. For example, there have been times where you'll see in the inner city there's been rioting, there has been destruction of property and things of this nature. But we've always seen it in terms of, let's say in the UK, they have had, or maybe in South America as well, where some of the soccer teams have won the World Cup, and in celebration, they have just been destroying the downtown and destroying people's places of business and things like that. And somehow it's considered socially acceptable because, after all, it's the World Cup and you won the World Cup. So people are less likely to be shocked in those kinds of situations. And that all has to do with emotions, right? So the 4-branch model then, just continuing on, this slide wants to take a look at performance measures, how people are assessed in this particular manner. So the 4-branch model: perception and expression of emotion, use of emotion to facilitate thinking, understanding emotion, management of emotion, these 4 things in these particular 4 areas. 8 tasks for people to complete. So let's say that the 4-branch model of emotional intelligence is a good model. I'm not saying it is, but I'm just, if we stipulate that, then we say, well, how do we measure that then? And this becomes the all critical thing. How do you measure it in terms of emotional intelligence? So this 8 tasks for people is a particular way to apply measures to require certain respondents that are involved in kind of this skills test, or these 4 emotion skills. And this is done through 8 particular tasks. And in each task, an emotional scenario is presented, and the respondent is asked to evaluate different resolutions. This is this Mayer, Solove, Caruso emotional intelligence test. It's MSCEIT is the acronym for it. This consists of 141 questions that measure perception of emotion, the use of emotion to facilitate thinking, those 4 things: understanding of emotion and management of emotion. So this particular test, the most common test, is written, but it's not performance. So we just want to compare these. I'm not being really clear here, so I want to back up just for a second. What we're talking about are 8 tasks for people to complete. Okay, so this is a task-oriented sort of thing. And yet the most common way that emotional intelligence is measured is through this MSCEIT 141 questions. So we'd have to say pros and cons versus some ability type of test, like give us some tasks to perform to demonstrate or to show this, or do you just give us questions to answer? So when you look at a written type of test or assessment, it's easy then to assess many people, because you can basically say, well, here are the same questions given to the same groups of people all the time. So it's fairly standardized. But the cons to this is that people may have skills that they could demonstrate that cannot otherwise be recorded on a particular written test or identified on a particular test. I mean, you know this. You know this in the sense of some of you would rather show what you know than have to explain it or have to answer very objective, specific questions about something. And some of this goes to how people learn, and some of this goes to how you measure intelligence. And so in this case, how you measure emotional intelligence, it may not be a fair representation if you're just asking somebody a bunch of questions as opposed to observing people display certain aspects of emotion. So what about the mixed and traits? You use the ability models, and we see some sense of that. Mixed and trait models then as well. We have the Boyatz's Goleman model. We mentioned Goleman before. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship manage, and the bar on, and we're just saying this is what these mixed models, so mixed in the sense of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. The bar on model, intrapersonal skills, interpersonal skills, adaptability, and mood. So what would be like similarities and differences of these two models in assessing emotional intelligence? Each one of these areas, like self-awareness, these are all emotional domains. Like there are certain emotions that go along with self. If you're self-aware, you're sort of introspective, I should say. We might say self-conscious. Yeah, you know, people that are acutely self-conscious. They're always concerned about what other people think about them and things of that nature. So this BG model, the one at the top, we could call it the BG model, seems to cover only intrapersonal and interpersonal skills. But the bar-on model includes the additional factors of adaptability that you see there, stress management, and mood. So if you look at that in contradistinction to the previous, the four-branch model, the four-branch model uses perception of emotion, use of emotion to facilitate thinking, understanding of emotion, management of emotion, while here you have facilitate thinking and understanding emotion are not completely covered under the BG model and the bar-on model. So what does this really tell you in psychology? That you can talk all day about emotional intelligence, but if you step back and say, what's the value to me? Is this something that I possess, and to what degree? Well, it would depend on how it's being measured and what it is. If you're saying that, emotional intelligence is all about self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship of management, then you could measure those and determine, just like in an IQ test, a standard IQ test, and you could measure, but it's all relative to that particular kind of assessment. And so you can see this is all over the place. And I would step back a long ways and just appreciate the fact that there is such a thing, and you may not refer to it as this, as emotional intelligence. That there is a kind of emotional smartness, being smart about your emotions. And we can sort of step back and acknowledge that, even if we're going to limit that, and protect ourselves a bit, and just say that what we're talking about is God-given emotions that need to be used to enhance our walk with Christ, or they could become an impediment, easy for you to say, an impediment to your walk with Christ and to your life with God. Then trait model, the trait emotional intelligence model. So this is a constellation. It says here, constellation of self-perceived emotion-related personality traits. But notice, this is self-perceived. Nobody's applying a particular standard or measuring rubric here. So it's up to the individual to self-perceive their emotional intelligence. So how is this different to the models that we've discussed so far? So rather than being measurable through tests, the trait model is self-perceived. There are no specific categories or skills. So it's called sometimes self-efficacy, or sometimes a self-report, or if you want to be more technical, you'd say a self-schema, in terms of one's well-being, self-control, emotional sociability, things of this nature. And it's somewhat related to personality traits. When you study personality theory, you know, there are certain traits. And so here with personality, you're saying, well, is this person introverted, extroverted? Are they agreeable? Are they open? Are they conscientious? Those are certain traits. And to what range, again, what range of trait what range do you possess that trait? And then an overall personality comes out of that. So one pretty much has a personality. Your character then is the public display of certain of those traits, which then can be in a particular range and associated with the display of certain emotions, which is what we're finding here. So it's this idea of, well, here's another model, but this one you sort of have to understand yourself. It's self-perceived. It's tied into self-awareness. Then there's the mixed and trait model together. So pros and cons maybe of this particular form. So you have self-report measures. Let's just say the mix that we looked at in the trait. So there's self-report measures, perception of emotional skills. So mixed and trait emotional intelligence models are evaluated through self-reporting. So you're either, saying I'm taking some type of a test that says, yes, this is true of me, or not, but these are, or you're just perceiving it. It's very quick to administer, but it's vulnerable to bias, obviously, because it's just your own personal biases. So the validity of these types of tests and their ability to measure emotional intelligence are kind of linked to the level of bias. So some people fall prey to social desirability bias. If you think others want you to be this way, that perhaps you value that as a positive trait, you can inflate personal abilities and skills. There's also a low correlation between self-report measures and performance measures. That is, they hardly show any relation between the two variables. So what are the pros and cons? Maybe the pros, you can cover more skills than a set of close-ended questions, or people's perceptions of their own abilities may be inaccurate, which in case they quite often are. So last word, this is kind of an exercise, and won't spend a lot of time here, but the idea is to get a group of students together, let's say, and you sort of prime the pump with a first statement. For example, what you had here, he realized the child had seen him and he couldn't let him get away. So there's a statement, right? And without context, it means absolutely nothing. But you could start with this and then just say that the next person in line or in this circle has to continue the story by using the last word. So you would then begin your part with away. And then you would say your sentence, and the next person then has to begin with your last word, and on and on and on and on. So it's really an exercise to determine how you feel while you are doing it. And so here's just some of the instructions that go along with that. Have fun. But so how does this type of this make you feel? And some of you would be very, very comfortable in this type of setting. Other people would be very uncomfortable in this setting. For example, as you're standing there in line, then waiting, for your opportunity to speak, do you feel nervous? Do you feel self-conscious? Other people would feel quite relaxed. So you might feel emotional vulnerability, as it says here. Do you feel emotionally vulnerable? And maybe that could be a good thing. Maybe it could be a bad thing. It's all stress bad. For example, could it be an enhancement? Could it be a detriment? So an enhancement, you may have a bunch of nervous energy, but some people work best when the stress is the highest. And so you just don't recommend high stress consistently, but sometimes you need a considerable amount. I can think of, not in an improvisation setting, but that's just to create the stress. But I can think of certainly a lot of stressful situations when I've had to have to function at a high level. So you can do that. Again, it's how you deal with that emotion. You can let it crush you and destroy you, or you can say, I recognize that emotion, I can use this as fuel to energize and to get clarity of thought and to energize other aspects of my total package of moods and abilities that are just lying dormant, were they not awakened by this sort of sense of urgency and immediacy. Can it be a detriment? Well, I suppose somebody who's in such a relaxed state, on the one hand, a relaxed state, they might be more creative, but on the other hand, they might be less attentive also. And so you might think, well, I found that the relaxed person tends to get annoyed at the energetic person because, the energetic person is getting a lot done. The relaxed person gets annoyed because they're saying, stop getting all that stuff done, come back to the rest of the world and join me. So being relaxed for a good reason, because your life is in God's hands and you're trusting in Him, that's obviously acceptable and ideal and where you want to be. But if it's relaxed because you are procrastinating things you ought to be doing, or you're neglectful, or you're lazy, then that is a huge detriment to living a God-honoring life. So you can just see where all of these emotions require a lot of self-reflection, do they not? I mean, you really have to take a step back and look at each single one of these emotions, the psychology of the Christian life, and take this to Scripture and look at various displays of emotion when you're looking at the disciples, when you're looking at Old Testament figures. You can recall occasions where Moses got angry and he struck the rock, but he did it a second time when God said, "Speak to the rock." And so what came out of that? Was it his frustration because of dealing with complaining people? What was it? So you can look at emotion and say that there are certain occasions when if David is doing battle against the Philistines, well, there's an emotion for a righteous cause. But if David is peering at a woman from his rooftop and lusting after her, well, there's an emotion for a bad case. So there are these emotions. But there is a right application of that emotion and a wrong application of that emotion. Not just saying emotion is bad. You shouldn't have emotion. So let's leave it there. There's a couple other things by way of application, but I think it's enough said on this subject. So it's like a day before Easter, and by the time you view this, it'll be after Easter. But I trust that you guys will all be blessed with your families whenever you can all get back together again.